Hello, my name is Akram Khatir. I am the co-editor of Mashriq al-Mahjar, a journal of Middle East and North African Migration Studies, and the director of the Moise Khairallah Center for Lebanese Studies at North Carolina State University. So Mashriq al-Mahjar is an online, open access, peer-reviewed journal devoted to disseminating original research on migration from, to, and within the Middle East and North Africa. Aside from publishing articles, book reviews, roundtables, and editorials, and as part of our effort to highlight remarkable new research, we have launched a series of conversations with authors whose work makes an important intervention into mobility and migration studies. So today, we are very delighted to be speaking with Dr. Celine Regnard, who is a research professor at Aix-Marseille Université in France. Dr. Regnard has published extensively on migration, the history of Marseille, the history of police and violence in Marseille. But today, we are going to be talking with her about her latest book that just came out almost 2 weeks ago, I think. It's called En Transit, Les Syriens à Beyrouth, Marseille, Le Havre, and New York between 1880 and 1914. And at the end of this conversation, I will provide a link about where you can be ordering this book. Celine, welcome. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I sent you some questions with regard to the book. So we'll start with the questions as I sent them. Can you tell us a little bit about your path to becoming a historian, about your previous work before the current book, En Transit?
Yes, of course. But first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So I have always been passionate about history, and especially the history of people without a history. My favorite period has always been the 19th century, particularly the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. It is a period that I'm particularly fond of in art, architecture, and literature. So to come back to my background, I first wrote a PhD on violence and delinquency in Marseille in the 19th century, based on police and justice archives. This is quite coherent with my tastes, since these archives allows me to have access to everyday facts which concern the life of the common people. This thesis was published in 2009. This work opened my eyes to the history of immigration in Marseille. And after that, I have continued to explore this theme with publications on cosmopolitanism in the city and of the critique of the notion of cosmopolitanism. The book was entitled The Bataille de Marseille, The Battles of Marseille, Les Batailles de Marseille, 2013. Indeed, it is often taken for granted that Marseille is a cosmopolitan city, is a city where relations between nationalities are peaceful, which is far from always being the case. I also worked on the history of Italians in the city, and I wrote a book on the history of Chinese workers who came to work in France and in Marseille during the First World War. That was in 2018. As I was used to police and justice archives, I also studied the history of the police in Marseille. I have edited 2 books on this issue, which was not well known. The first book is a history of the institution in its relationship with the population in 2020. And the second book is a history of how the police controlled mobilities, especially in Marseille, in 2018. In this last book, which has a comparative dimension, I wrote an article on the control of human mobilities in Marseille and New York. So the subject was close to En Transit. Finally, because this question interests me, I worked on the history of popular housing in Marseille, like furnished hotels, slums, etc., in a book published in 2018. I would like to add that all this work was made possible by research groups to which I belonged, and that the exchange with the colleagues were very important in my work and in my career to come today to the publication of En Transit.
Obviously, you have a very illustrious career, a very accomplished career in terms of publication, in terms of research. But I'm kind of curious how you decided to write En Transit. What is it that, because a lot of historians, sometimes they arrive at, a project because they read something here, they encounter something there, and all of a sudden becomes an idea that germinates and ultimately becomes a book. So I'm kind of curious if you can take us through the journey of what prompted you to write this book.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The germination of the idea is very interesting. So as I just said, my membership in research groups in my research unit, TELEM in Aix-Marseille Université, is very, very important. Especially the discussions with my colleagues in history, geography, and sociology have been decisive. We have worked and discussed a lot around the notion of circulation in migration, and the fact that migrations are multidirectional and that they take place in stages. I started to work on a vision of the port of Marseille, not only as a space of immigration and settlements, but also as a space of passage and departure. I first wrote a small studies on Italians who were in transit in Marseille and who left for North and South America. And gradually, I began to see the importance of the notion of transit for Marseille, and just for Marseille at this stage. While I was working in the archives of the police of the port of Marseille, I saw many documents concerning the Syrians. And I didn't know their history at all. But being curious, I became interested. And in fact, I just realized there were very few Turks, Syrians, Lebanese living in Marseille at that time compared to the Italians, for instance. So it seemed like a good case study to work on transit, just transit. I became aware of the Syrian community in New York after that, and of their presence in the United States. And from there, a project of comparative history of two cities of transit, that is to say Marseille and New York, was born in my mind. After that, I had the chance to be awarded a 5-year grant to work on this issue. And at first, I wanted to focus on transit in general, but soon enough, I narrowed it down to the Syrians because I fell in love with the Syrians a little bit, and because their story allowed me to test my hypothesis of transit city. The grant allowed me to make several archive trips in Paris, Rouen, Le Havre, Washington, D.C., New York, and to receive a fellowship for the Moïse Kerala Center in North Carolina State University. So this is what gave birth to this research and to this book, which is a published version of my second thesis, necessary in France to become a full professor.
So for both scholars, researchers, and historians, but also if somebody is from outside academia, how would you describe En Transit as a historical study? Or, if one is to say, what is the main narrative / argument of the book? What are you trying to get at? Because in many ways, you are actually making a very new and unique intervention in the study of mobility, because specifically, if one is to look at Syrian, Lebanese histories of migration, most of the time we study them where they come from, where they arrive, but rarely about the journey itself. And your intervention is really quite remarkable and very fresh, really, in that sense. So I'm kind of curious if you can talk a little bit about what you're trying to get at in terms of the study of the various stages along the way.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this question. In fact, it is a book about Syrian migration, of course, between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic at the end of the 19th century, but also it is a book about transit. I tried to write a book about transit. If you look at the construction of the book, it is crucial, this construction, from a scientific point of view. What I wanted to show mainly is two points. On the one hand, that the moment of transit is an integral part of the migratory experience. And on the other hand, what happens in this moment? So that's why, as you said, I did not choose a construction starting from a point A, which could be Beyrouth, for example, to a point B, Marseille, a point C, Le Havre, and a point D, New York. This would have minimized the notion of circulation and the notion of transit. There would have been repetitions in my writing, and the main subject would have been diluted in a book about Syrian migration, which is, as you know, a subject that is already well known. So my book is designed in 5 thematic chapters, and each of this chapter is a very important aspect, I think, of the transit experience. The first one is accommodation between 2 journeys. The second one is the control at all the crossing points. The third one are the problems encountered, such as theft, scams, etc. The fourth chapter is about solutions developed by the migrants, that is to say, agency, an aspect which is very, very important to me. And the last chapter is about the representations, the visions of the migrants in France and in the United States. And here the comparison is very, very interesting, I think, because it's not the same image of the migrants. So studying the Syrians is very interesting, I think, because it's a population that has not settled in France, and it's a population that has cultural habits, language, a way of dressing, which is not always Western. So the gap is very important in France, but in the United States too, and the risk of having problems during the transit is great. The representations are also very interesting because they bring Orientalism into play, of course. So the main argument of the book is that transit is a fundamental moment of the migratory experience because it is where the ability of migrants to deploy their personal resources to make their project succeed is at stake. From a more personal point of view, it's a very simple argument, but this experience moves me a lot, and I see it as a metaphor for existence, what is happening during these transit phases. So that's the pitch of my book.
Thank you so much for that précis that you provided, which is wonderful. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that I hadn't written down, and so please feel comfortable to answer in French, and we can, subtitle it in English. So again,
okay, no, I'll try in English.
Whatever you come. But I want to go a little further because I think you alluded to a couple of things that I want to explore a little bit more. The first one is perhaps in the last chapter on representation, in which you are saying that the way these immigrants were represented in Marseille is to a certain extent different than how they were represented in the United States. And I was wondering if you can elaborate or talk a little bit more about that. What differences do you see in that representation?
I think the main difference relates on the fact that they are not settling in France. And so they are not perceived as invaders or immigrants. They are passengers. They are in transit in France, and it's quite obvious when you read the press or police archives. Instead, in the United States, they will settle, they will stay. So the question about their perception is not really the same. The second thing is that I think the question of the race is less important in France at that time than in the United States. French people and French politics are literally obsessed at the end of the 19th century by the question of integration, but it is a social and political integration, not a racial integration. And of course, their attention goes to the Italians who settled in France, or the Spanish who settled in France, but not really the Syrian and Lebanese. In the United States, the perception of the Syrian I don't know if you agree with me, but the race is very important. Why? Because if you want to be American, you have to be a free white person. So the Syrians have to prove that they are white, or that they can enter in the white people category. That is not the same in France. Maybe a last difference is the perception of their trade ability, their gift for trade and commerce, trade. How do you say it in English? I think it's more, it's something that is put forward in the United States and not so much in France. The difference is, I think it's quite obvious. The American society pays a lot of attention to this quality, which is a cliché, but partly true. And in France, it's not so important. So the difference are, it's not a radical opposition, but like an éventail, I don't know how you say it in English, a nuancier of differences.
So let's talk a little bit about the immigrants themselves, because you say in the beginning of the book that you want to provide agency to these immigrants, but also you want to write a history that, as much as possible, and we'll talk about the archives later, but as much as possible, gives their point of view, their experiences. Mm-hmm. And you alluded to the fact that this being in transit, or transit, is an experience that is fundamental to who we are as people in general, but certainly to the Syro-Lebanese immigrant experience. So I'm kind of curious that as you are doing research, do you find that a lot of these immigrants, that this experience of transit, going on a ship, going through medical controls, finding a place to stay where more likely than not they didn't have the linguistic abilities, sometimes being swindled or stolen from, and in the introduction of the book, perhaps the most tragic is an act of murder. Did these experiences, from what you looked at, leave an impression upon them and change them? In other words, did this transit experience transform these immigrants in a way? Because we talk a lot about how when they arrive in the United States or in Brazil or in Argentina, they are changed by that experience. But I'm kind of curious if the transit experience itself also is beginning to transform them before even they set foot in the Americas or West Africa.
Wow, it's a difficult question. I think they are changed by the experience. So the first answer is, of course, that it's very difficult to answer this question, because the archives are not very detailed on this point. If you know the NAF collection, you know that the notes are very simple, a few lines. It's very rare to have the whole interview of the person. I couldn't hear the interviews because I would not have understood the interviews, and they are being restored, actually. So it's very difficult to have access to them. So that's the first answer. Maybe it's very difficult to have access to, first, the narrative of the experience. Second, the heritage of the experience. Did this experience transform their life? It's very difficult to answer this question. What I think and what I observe is that the circulation process produce a learning of transit. they learn from their experiences. So those who experiment the travel many times have learned, and they give informations to others. So this is a first answer to your question. They were transformed in the way that they, yes, they learned. They were used to transit. They know how to escape the traps, etc. But how did their life changed after this experience? It's very difficult to say, because finally migration changes your life. So, and transit being a part of migration, but you're right, I think it's a good subject maybe for another study, but I'm afraid we have not sufficient archive to elaborate on this question.
Thank you so much, and I completely agree. I think the archives are a bit difficult on that.
Mm-hmm.
You do quote the book of Khalid with Amir Rihani, which he describes that experience, but
Yes.
he only describes the experience, and we don't really know what happens afterwards, what leaves that. So it's a very difficult question. So let's move on to next question. So what would you consider to be the book's main intervention within the fields of mobility and migration studies, Mediterranean studies, and the history of France? Because I mean, clearly you're intersecting with a lot of histories. So I'm kind of curious where you see your interventions being.
Yes, well, I think we answered already partly the question, but I'll sum up if you want. So I think the main contribution of the book in the field of migration studies is to build a historical approach of the notion of transit. It is a notion, a concept that has been worked on in geography, sociology, anthropology. And it is understandable because our current world shows that problems of blocked transit is at the heart of migratory experience. But what struck me when I read the works of migration historians was that departures, arrivals, returns, and even journeys, as you said, had been studied, but not transit, as if nothing interesting was happening at those moments. I was, of course, very influenced by the work on the notion of waiting, which is very close. The notion of waiting, which was studied by Nancy L. Green, for example, or Laurent Vidal, which is a French historian, or I don't know if you know Christine Jacobsen, which is a Swedish anthropologist, who works actually brilliantly on the waiting. So I contributed to the definition of this notion of transit and to its historical approach. As I say in the book, transit is not a similar reality for those who experienced it. It's not really a fixed concept. I call it a category of practice, deeply dependent on the geopolitical context, the level of wealth of individuals, the quality of transportation connections, the urban infrastructure of housing. The difference between Marseille and Le Havre, for instance, is clear. The experience and information that individuals have, the presence of a community, of a family network, etc. Another contribution of the book in the field of migration studies is to write a history based on testimonies, as we just said, so to try a history from below, even it's never an evidence. From the point of view of Mediterranean studies, this book completes the history of Syrian and Lebanese migration in the Mediterranean. The Marseille stage was already somewhat known. Notably, it is mentioned in Andrew Arsan's book, Interlopers of Empire. There are also a few lines in the main study on the history of immigration in Marseille, Migrants, directed by Émile Temim. But for the new history of Marseille, this emphasis on transit is crucial. As I said earlier, we must get away from a vision of the city's history as a receptacle for migration. We must see also Marseille as a city of transit. It's quite the same, I would like to say, for the history of France. My work brings a new dimension to the vision of a country of immigration. France is, of course, a country of immigration, but it is also a country of transit. This had been underlined in some works, for instance, on Le Havre by Camille Maire, on the work of Camille Maire. And my work shows that thousands of individuals crossed France to reach the Atlantic coast of France and then South America or North America. So even in Paris, not only on the coast, but even in Paris, the transit is very important. And more generally, the question of the French space as a border space, a space where American control practices were reflected, and also a space that functioned as a trap for those who were turned away, is quite new, I think. And that's what I try to demonstrate in this book.
And you do it brilliantly, by the way. It's just beautifully rendered.
Thank you.
It really is. It's just that, especially that segment, is completely novel. Now, I want to ask you a question that I hadn't sent you earlier, but it follows on what you just said, and it really kind of follows your lead, the way you started the book, in which you recount, again, this tragic story of a murder that happens in a hotel. But then you go on to talk about these moments, and you end the book by a catalog of what was in her little valise, in her little suitcase, which was incredibly sad for me to read. I thought it was a very powerful way to end the book, because it immediately brought her humanity forward. But in both the beginning and the end, you allude to the fact that a lot of us as historians encounter these little glimpses, and then that's all we have, just a little glimpse. And in the end, it becomes very difficult. How do you tell a story based on a glimpse? How do you construct a history, which is really the challenge that you presented for yourself. So I'm kind of curious, again, to follow through on this kind of impact on France, because these individuals, thousands of them, are coming through. They're going to the rail stations, hotels, cafe. Sometimes they do a little bit of work. They go to port cities. What impact do they have on, the lives around them in France? I mean, how is France transformed by that? This group of people going up and down. I'm kind of curious if there was anything that you were able, I know that in the book you allude to some stuff, but is there something that had transformed the way France is, or French society is, with the thousands upon, actually hundreds of thousands going through?
Yeah. The first thing I'm gonna answer you is that for this history of murder, and this is a little story, a tragic story, and I know it for 15 years. Because I read it first time when I was working in the archives for my PhD. But at that time, this history meant nothing to me. It was impossible to use it for my work, so I just read it and forgot it. And when I began to work on this history of Syrians and Lebanese traveling to Marseille, I remember this story. And it's my way to write history. I like to explain, bringing facts together with a lot of lectures and bibliography, but I liked also to write little stories. And I was thinking it was bringing, as you said, a lot of humanity in this book, to begin and to end with this woman, which above all has a very interesting history, because she was returning to Lebanon She was a woman, and she was an elderly woman. She was 60 years old. And it was the 6th or 7th trip to Marseille, through Marseille. So it's very interesting just to learn about the transit phenomenon, the history of this woman. So, and the second part of your question was, sorry, I just forgot it.
All right, it's because you have, like her, you have hundreds of thousands coming through Marseille, going to Paris. I'm just
the consequences on France.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm tempted to say to you very, very few consequences. Maybe that's why French historians didn't pay few attention to this history. In Marseille, it's a bit different because the links between Marseille and the Levant are trade links, especially, are close for centuries, and there was a small population of Turks and Syrians in Marseille at that time. There were Arabic-speaking people. So Marseille maybe is the more oriental city in France. But it's very difficult to answer to this question. In fact, less than the USA or than any other country of settlement, because it's a country of transits.
No, I can appreciate it. It's a very, I appreciate how difficult the question is, but as historians, we, you know, there are all of these like millions upon millions of brief encounters, and it's a very challenging way to figure out how do these, even if they are 20 seconds or a minute or 5 minutes encounters, how do they alter people and then, you know, society as a whole? So that's kind of a very difficult question to answer. I grant you that. Yeah. But then at the same time, it's a very intriguing question.
For French people, I think these Syrians and Lebanese crossing Marseille and other French cities are just exotic. They look at them as a curiosity, I think.
Yeah, and that in itself becomes interesting because it shapes what exotic is and how you begin to see.
Of course.
So, but I grant you, you're absolutely right. It's a very difficult question to answer, but to me, it's very intriguing. Okay, so let's talk about archives. I'm jumping to the last question because I am it's just remarkable how much research you have done. I mean, I think it's amazing the various archives that you tapped into. And so I was kind of curious if you talk a little bit about the archives that you used and how you interrogated these archives to get the information, especially because, as you very well know, archives have as many silences as they have information. And in fact, the politics of archives is they usually, you know, like if it's written by a police officer, it's their perspective on what happened. And so a lot of the times, you know, we are reading against the grain, so to speak, or trying to understand it a little different. So I'm kind of curious about these archives, how you use them and how you interrogated them.
Yes, of course, it's a fundamental question because if you have no archive, you have no history book. So it's fundamental. First of all, as you all understand, I love archives. So I write a history very close to archives, and it's a choice. It's a choice. I like to quote archive, to look at the very words used in the archives. Generally speaking, it's a way of writing history, but it's another subject. So for this study, I used archive that give a view from above, mainly. Police archives, ministry archives, immigration reports, even censuses. So this is, of course, very instructive, but not very new, because all these archives are very well known from historians. And the problem is, as you said, these archives has silences, and has also drawbacks. And the main drawback is that they give the impression that everything is going wrong, that Syrians have always problems, that migrants are perpetual victims and victims of those who want to rip them off, or that they are all being sent back from Ellis Island, which is not the case. So you have always to remember when you read these police archives or ministry archives, etc., that it's not the reality. It's a perception of reality. That's, I always explain to my students. Everything is not wrong, because if everything was wrong, no one could have passed to the United States. So that's the first point. And secondly, the second problem of these archives is that they tend to disembody the story, because when you hear about someone, you hear about him or her once, and then he or she falls immediately into obscurity. So it's very frustrating, because you never have the whole story. It's very difficult to retrace journeys and even lives, of course, life in these archives. So that's the first part of my archive work. And of course, the second part is more challenging. I try to supplement with archives that are closer to the people, to the migrants. And here, I must say, I was so lucky, so fortunate that the NAF collection exists. And when I opened this little box, it was really a revelation. You told me about this collection, and it was, I must say, these testimonies and these photographs and all these archives. It was, for me, it was love at first sight. I saw it and I was literally thrilled, because I knew I could write something different. So I used the notes Alexa Naf took during her interviews. As I said before, not the interviews themselves, because they are on tapes and in a very bad state. And I don't understand Arabic, so it would have been a problem. So I know it is a little problem, but these testimonies are written by Naf from the interviews, and I quote them always at the third person, so as to make very clear that it's not the exact testimony. It's a kind of transcription by Naf. And I completed this archive, this Alexa Naf investigation, with many pictures, photographs from the same collection. Pictures of Beyrouth, also, the Bonfils collection, press articles, very useful for the last chapter on representation, autobiographical testimonies, online or archived in Moise Kerala Center. And finally, I was very, very lucky to have all these archives and to cross them with official archives. Of course, there are always gaps in your documentation, silence, as you said before. For instance, I have very little documentation on the transit in Beirut, because I could not go there. The political situation was not good enough for me to go there, and the access to the Ottoman archive is very difficult, as you know. And I have a problem of reading too. And I succeed, I think, to reconstruct his stories, but not enough for my taste. It is very, very difficult to follow a person over a long period of time. It's also difficult to have an idea of their psychology, as you said before, and of their deep, deep feelings, which is, of course, not said in even in enough interviews. It's not said, it's hidden. So it's very difficult for us to work on that feelings and impressions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the biggest challenge about this, is to get into the intimate moment, the intimate lives of individuals. We have brief glances, but it's very difficult to gain access to them a little bit more. And I mean, I think what you're saying about the work, it leads me to think that collaborative research projects are really wonderful for that, because it allows those of us who have skills in one area but are lacking in another area to combine efforts. So I really, far too often, I think as historians, we end up working alone, which I understand why. This is how we're trained. You know, it's a very solitary kind of work, but, you know, as other fields do, geography, sociology, and anthropology, collaborations, I think, are more and more important for us to cross these linguistic and physical boundaries that some of us experience. So I hope in the future there'll be more collaborative work that will enrich the kind of work you're doing. So I want to conclude the conversation by asking you about what's next for you as a historian. You've got so much going on, so tell us a little bit about what your next research project is, or what your next projects are in general.
For the moment, I'm focused on the promotion of the book, which is going out in 2 weeks in France. After that, in fact, I don't know. I don't know, because I have many options. One of the options is to in deep some of the aspects I couldn't go in this book. I don't know which aspect and how. I need to talk with colleagues to have ideas. But it will have something to do with Syrian and Lebanese and with transit. I think I will stay on this subject because really it was a great experience to work on this subject, and I think there is a lot to do. So we'll stay in touch.
I think there is a lot to do. There's also South America. So there's transit.
Yeah, South America. I must learn Spanish, but it's something which is possible.
It's quite possible for you given the French background. But yeah. I think thinking about collaborative projects would be very good to move forward, because I think this is still a very important subject. And I mean, I would like to say it again. This is a very pioneering intervention into the field, and I think you've done a great job with it. So thank you so much for writing the book, and I look forward to getting a copy, a physical copy, when it comes out.